Welcome everyone to theScore Fantasy Football Podcast presented by Subway. I'm your host Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore, and I am joined by my co-host David P. Woods, a man who I think is glad that the Le'Veon Bell saga is over at this point, at least for the time being. We're going to have to revisit it in the offseason, I'm sure, but for now, Woods, this was a fantasy nightmare, obviously. Anyone that drafted him in the first round, this is worst case scenario. It's about as bad as it could possibly be for a first round pick. But obviously at this point, it's over this year. At least fantasy owners that had him can drop him and move on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of annoyed. I think, my day-to-day duties at theScore are mostly overseeing our news desk, and we wrote a lot of stories over this season. When is Bell going to report? Is he going to report? What's the latest on that? And then it all comes down to if anyone had actually read the CBA, like it was apparent Bell's agent didn't until very recently, if we believe the reports, they would have seen that he never had to report in the first place. He still gets to be a free agent. He's not really taggable again next year under the terms of the CBA. And he could have just stayed home and saved us all a lot of time and effort if before the season he had said, yeah, I'm just not going to report at all this year. And people wouldn't have had to draft him in fantasy. We could have just, it would have been smooth sailing for most of the year. So yeah, I'm a little annoyed by that. I feel bad for people who wasted a pick on him, but that's life in the NFL. And I guess for us, we got a lot of articles out of it. So maybe it was good for theScore. I don't know.
A lot of words were said, a lot of articles for sure, but like I said, at least everybody now can move on. Congratulations to James Conner owners. Looks like you're going to have a star the rest of the way now. On today's episode, Woods and I are going to identify a couple players who we think are announcing their arrivals as potential fantasy stars heading into this week. Then we're going to preview Week 11 with our guest, Bill Enright of ffchamps.com, another one of the most accurate experts out there. We're going to get his thoughts on all the key fantasy questions this week, including which players might be being overlooked heading into Week 11 and which players you should be stashing heading into the fantasy playoffs. We're down into the stretch run now. You should start looking at the fantasy playoffs and getting your roster ready. But before we get going today, I just want to thank everybody out there for subscribing to the podcast, for rating it, for reviewing it. I know we've encouraged you to do it almost every episode, but it's just been fantastic, all the support that we've gotten for the podcast this year, and we really do appreciate it, so keep it up. Let's take a look now at a couple players who have burst onto the scene in our Fantasy Arrivals segment, which is presented by our friends at Subway, home of the new Montreal Steak Spice collection. I'm going to shine the spotlight on Anthony Miller of the Bears. He's coming off his best game as a pro, 122 yards and a touchdown, and he played a season-high 74% of the snaps in that game. I talked about Miller last week in that overlooked section. I thought that people might be sleeping on him a little bit. Seems like they were. It's another reason to stick around to the end of the podcast, folks, so you can get some good nuggets in that segment there. But last week I mentioned his yardage totals were on the rise each week over the last month. He's averaging 7 targets per game during that stretch, and he was a second-round pick. It was clear they wanted to get the ball in his hands. They even gave him a couple rushing attempts recently, so they wanted to get the ball in his hands, and we saw him arrive with that performance, and I think he's going to be a big fantasy factor down the stretch in what looks to be a really good Bears offense.
For my choice here, it's sort of a reminder of a player who I think has already kind of arrived, but I think a lot of people have forgotten about just because we have such short memories, and that's Courtland Sutton. Remember how excited we were about him after the Broncos traded away Demaryius Thomas at the deadline? Sutton didn't do a ton in Week 9, the first game after the trade, and then the Broncos were on bye in Week 10, so he did literally nothing for you there. But put this guy in your lineup. Don't forget, we're excited about what he can do as a starting wide receiver in that offense, and this week he gets the Chargers. That's not a scary matchup by any stretch. I think we're going to see the Broncos really try to feature their rookie Sutton.
All right, good stuff. Let's bring on our guest today. It's Bill Enright, like I said, of ffchamps.com. Bill has finished in the top 10 of Fantasy Pro's most accurate expert competition each of the last 2 years, and he's in striking distance again this season. You can find him on Twitter at Bill Enright. Bill, we have been fortunate to have some of the most accurate experts on the podcast this season, and we're glad that we could keep that streak going. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think that you picked a good week to come on here because we have the heavyweight title fight of 2018, the 9-1 Kansas City Chiefs, the 9-1 Los Angeles Rams. These offenses have produced some of the best fantasy performances this season. Seems like that's probably going to be the case again this week. the highest projected point total of all time, 63.5 points. Obviously, you don't need us to tell you you're going to start Gurley and Hunt, Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, but Travis Kelce, I shouldn't forget Travis Kelce. Obviously, he's another great option in this game. But, Bill, is there anyone here that you wouldn't be willing to start in this game?
There absolutely is. Actually, two guys that I'm not going to start, and they're not really players. They are defense and special teams. Listen, the Rams defense is 95% owned on Yahoo. They've been very, very disappointing, but people are still starting them. You can't rely on them this week on Monday Night Football against the Chiefs. And the Chiefs defense, they're 60% owned. There's 6 teams on bye this week. So teams or fantasy managers are looking for defenses. But the Chiefs scored 15 points last week. People might think that they can rely on them once again in week 11, and that's just not the case. So get the Rams and Chiefs defense and special teams out of your lineups.
I totally agree with you there. I mean, even we're talking about guys like Reynolds, who's going to step in for Cooper Kupp now. The tight ends even are potentially streamable for the Rams there, looking at Gerald Everett. Even Tyler Higbee, he could catch a touchdown. It's going to be a high-scoring game. I think you're going to trot pretty much every piece of those offenses that you have in this one.
I think I might stay away from Chris Conley. I would pay attention to Sammy Watkins' status, but if Conley starts, I still don't think you can expect a ton out of him because we've just seen him sort of have opportunity after opportunity, and he never really does much. Beyond that, I think I'm with you guys. Let's just say we should be pretty thankful that this game moved back to Los Angeles because I think if it had been played in Mexico City on that pretty terrible field, I think it's possible we would have seen these coaches go with a more conservative game plan, not risk their players, maybe even go to the extreme length of benching some of their stars just to avoid injury risk. I mean, both these teams are clearly going to the playoffs. They need to think long term, but nope, we're going to get them on a good field in Los Angeles, and it should be a points explosion, so I can't wait for it.
Well, on the other side of the spectrum, we have the Texans and the Redskins. That has the second lowest projected point total of the week at 42.5. That is over 20 points less than the Chiefs-Rams game. That seems wild. Obviously, part of that, the reason for that is that the Redskins love to slow the game down, lean on that running attack, play some defense. That contributes to the low total. But, Bill, does that scare you off anyone in this game? Or are you confidently going to roll out all the Texans guys, even some of the Redskins guys? We haven't seen great things from all of them, but, rolling out guys like Adrian Peterson, it's going up against a pretty tough run defense there, or even Jordan Reed, who we haven't really seen it from this year.
It's funny because, in DFS, DraftKings, FanDuel, whatever your poison, but we always look at over-unders, right? Because we can take any player from any game. The player pool allows us to choose the players in, projected high-scoring outings. But in season long, we're stuck with our players. So DeAndre Hopkins, Adrian Peterson, Deshaun Watson, Jordan Reed, there's 6 teams on a bye this week. Lamar Miller's going to be in lineups. We're using these guys because for the most part, you drafted them to be starters on your team. And now in week 11, 6 teams on a bye. Yeah, it's projected for a low total, but in season long, there's very limited options.
Boone, you asked if we'd be confidently starting these guys. I don't think you can ever be confident in Jordan Reed. I think on the Texans side, I might try not to start Demaryius Thomas and Kiki Cutie until we have a little bit of a better idea about how they're going to split targets. But as Bill said, with a lot of teams on bye, you may not have that luxury. And as for the Redskins passing attack, that's another collective unit that I think I would generally try to avoid just because, there's some injuries there and they just haven't really been putting up big numbers recently. But you may not have an option but to start someone there.
I think when it comes to the Texans, I'm still willing to put everybody on the field there. And I think Bill's right when you talk about 6 teams on bye. It really forces you to. It's the Redskins that, with all the injuries on that offensive line, no, I don't think I'm that confident playing Adrian Peterson. And I definitely don't like what we've seen from Jordan Reed at all this year. And with Vance McDonald and Austin Hooper and, even Eric Ebron, you're starting to see guys come on that are just passing him in the rankings. And I think this week, Vance McDonald, Hooper, both guys that I'm going to consider over Jordan Reed. One of the most puzzling questions heading into week 11 here is just what to do with this Seahawks backfield. With Chris Carson out, Mike Davis was delivering, had 107 yards from scrimmage 2 weeks ago. That's when Carson left the game. And then this most recent week, came back, put up 80 yards and a touchdown when Carson was sidelined. We also saw Rashad Penny wake up in that game, had 108 rushing yards on 12 carries, had a touchdown of his own. Woods and I discussed the team's desire. I mean, Penny is a first-round pick, and you have to think as the year goes on, they're probably going to try to give him a chance to take that job, or so you would think. This week, we see Carson healthy, practicing again. Now we're seeing the team kind of say Carson's going to be the starter, and maybe Penny's going to be the guy that's left out here. It's very difficult to trust anything that Pete Carroll says when it comes to injuries, when it comes to player performance. But, Bill, how are you going to approach the Seahawks backfield this week?
It's funny because I read your waiver wire article on theScore, and I saw your little write-up about you can't trust Pete Carroll, and you just mentioned it again. And it's so true because he's either overly optimistic about every single one of his players, or he just blatantly misleads the fan base and the media about which players he's going to use. The Eddie Lacy experiment failed. C.J. Prosise failed. J.D. McKissick failed. Thomas Rawls failed. The best back they had since Marshawn Lynch left is Alex Collins, and he's playing in Baltimore. Now, the Seahawks, they love to run the football. I think they have the third most rushing plays in the league, 258 rushing attempts this year. That helps with Russell Wilson, of course. Third least passing attempts with 230. So we know they want to run the football. We just don't know who's going to run the football. And that's the problem that fantasy managers have when you're drafting a running back in that Seattle backfield. I was not surprised to see Rashad Penny pop off a few big plays. I don't know if I can project him to do that every week going forward. I hate using Thursday night running backs when there's a lot of questions. And I think there's a lot of questions with the Seahawks backfield, namely, Chris Carson and his injury, the usage of Mike Davis, and how much Rashad Penny is going to get the ball this week.
Yeah, I mean, with them saying that Carson's going to come back and is going to be healthy for this game, I am going to trot him out there. I think the confidence level is not really there, but on a week with 6 teams on bye, he's going to sneak into sort of that borderline low-end RB2 range for me. I think with Penny, I still recommend people picking him up, even though I thought there was a chance Carson would miss this game on a short week. But with Penny, there's still going to be upside, and I think it might not come until a little bit later in the season. But if the Seahawks fall out of the playoff hunt, that would be the time in my mind where now they're going to turn it over, see what they have for the future there. What do you think, Woods?
Yeah, I came into this week really high on Penny, and it has just sort of fallen apart because first I thought Carson probably wouldn't play, and now it looks like he is going to play. And we see report today or some rumblings that with Penny, the reason he's not getting on the field is that he just doesn't really know the playbook. And to me, that gets planted by the coach and the media to sort of give the rookie a kick in the butt. And I hate to see that because that makes me think they still don't trust Penny. Even after he looked really good in Week 10, he had 108 yards and a touchdown on just 12 carries, and more than he'd done in the first 9 weeks of his career. So I was excited about Penny. I think he's still going to get some clarity of workload. Like Boone said, when the Seahawks are basically eliminated from playoff contention, they have to play him. I mean, they spent a first-round pick on this guy. They passed on names like Sony Michel, Nick Chubb, Kerryon Johnson, Darius Geis. They made him the second running back taken in the draft. They have to play him and see what they have. It's coming at some point, and I think the Rams can clinch the division, I think, this week if certain things fall in place. So it may be coming sooner than we think, but this week, I don't see how you can trust Rashad Penny.
Well, one of the reasons that we saw Penny and Davis show any fantasy value at all was because of Carson's injury, right? So we strangely haven't seen that many running backs go down with really, really serious injuries. Obviously, some guys have missed some time, but we've been pretty fortunate on that front this year. At receivers, though, there's a lot of receivers that are missing time right now. And let's just look at some of the receiving corps here that are missing some starters. The Packers, Geronimo Allison on IR. Randall Cobb continues to deal with injuries. He's been ruled out this week. The Bengals, A.J. Green's out. The Raiders, Martavis Bryant, likely to miss quite a bit of time here. And Jordy Nelson also got banged up last week. The Redskins, Paul Richardson on IR. Jamison Crowder just can't get healthy there. Even teams like the Titans, Taylon Taylor's been hurting. The Lions, we saw Marvin Jones leave the game last week. We're going to have to monitor that injury this week. Bill, when you're looking at these receiving cores, anytime when there's injuries, there is a chance to find fantasy value. It's an opportunity for fantasy owners. Do you think in any of these injury-riddled receiving cores, there's any value to be dug up?
I always feel like I could find a wide receiver that is capable of putting up 10 points in a PPR league. It's a lot harder to replace running backs. Wide receivers, I always feel like I can pick and choose and work the waiver wire and find a good matchup. So it may not be, I just lost Cooper Kupp, right? I'm devastated. Do I think Brandon LaFell can get me 65% of those points back in a PPR league? I really do, because there's no one else that Derek Carr can throw the ball to. Same thing like we saw with the Bengals last week, and John Ross got into the end zone. So I always feel like there is opportunity for wide receivers, because teams don't just stop passing the football. They have to get the ball out of the quarterback's hands other than running the football. So to me, wide receiver is one of the easiest positions that you can replace. I'm not saying that you can just go out on the waiver wire and replace A.J. Green, but you can get some of those points back. Whereas a running back, let's say if Todd Gurley went down, is Malcolm Brown really going to do what Gurley's doing right now? Probably not.
I'll add Maurice Harris to this. I went up and down that list. There's not a whole lot of names I'm excited about at all, but he's getting some targets in Washington. I think he's usable in PPR leagues as long as Jamison Crowder is out.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when you look at this question, there's just a couple offenses in there that I'm not sure that I really want to touch, right? Like the Raiders, don't really think I want to get involved in that. The Redskins, Woods mentioned earlier, haven't seen much from their passing game, so I just don't want to touch those. With the Lions, we just don't have an option there that looks great in my mind. Obviously, Kenny Galladay, and that's the one thing with this question. We're not talking about the top guys on these teams, right? Of course, when you're talking about the Packers, this gives Devontae Adams a bit of a bump. When you're talking about the Lions now, if Kenny Galladay is the last man standing there, gives him a bump for sure. But there's just not that much value. John Ross, you're going to take a swing with him potentially, but not that much value in this group, I don't think, unfortunately.
What about Marquez Valdez-Scantling in Green Bay? Is he now a must-start for you, Boone?
I've had him ranked. Yeah, I had him ranked in the top 20 last week. I know he didn't deliver there, but he's going to be not far off that. Yeah, I think he's a borderline wide receiver too. I wouldn't even put him amongst that group of guys. I think he's already ascended. He's what we would love to see John Ross become, essentially, over the next few weeks. That would be best case scenario, I think, for John Ross. And sticking with injuries here, it could have a really big impact on the Ravens offense at quarterback. We're recording this on Wednesday. We saw that Joe Flacco did not practice today. We're going to have to monitor his status as the week unfolds. I know the team has said he could still play even if he doesn't practice, but he's dealing with the hip injury. Could cause him to miss some time here. Could cause him to be limited even if he does play. And that might open the door for Lamar Jackson. And we can admit, I think, that Jackson probably isn't completely ready to be a prolific NFL quarterback. I think that's safe to say. But we've seen the effect that mobile quarterbacks can have in fantasy. I went out and picked up Jackson in a bunch of leagues, not just for his upside, but also to block other opponents. I don't want to be going up against him in the fantasy playoffs with the schedule they have and with his ceiling. He's a guy that could come in, put up top 10 numbers potentially. Bill, you and I are going to have the task this week of trying to rank Jackson if he's playing. I mean, by Sunday, we're going to have a better idea here whether it's going to be him or not. I already have him in my rankings at this point, but if he does get the start, where are you going to have him in your rankings?
I'll probably have him inside the top 25. There's a couple things going on here, right? One is, let's get rid of this RG3 nonsense, right? Put Lamar Jackson under center. That's what the fans want to see. That's why you drafted him in the first round. Don't BS us anymore, Baltimore Ravens and John Harbaugh, with this RG3 nonsense. No one wants to see him. If you're trying to make the playoffs, fine. But if Flacco's not playing, let Lamar Jackson go under center. That's number one. Number two is, this is where fantasy managers have to separate the NFL reality versus fantasy football. Because reality, we don't think Lamar Jackson is going to blow the world away. But in fantasy, anytime a quarterback is a dual threat and has that rushing capability, you have to take them seriously. You have to legitimately think to yourself, okay, if he gets 60 yards rushing this week, that's better than a passing touchdown to go along with all of his passing stats. We've seen quarterbacks in fantasy do really well in fantasy football and not so well in reality. So that's the second thing when you're dealing with Lamar Jackson. Now, I think if he's out there this week against a Bengals defense that has not been playing really well, I will definitely rank him inside the top 25. And it's for sure by Sunday, if I know that he's starting and he's getting all the first team reps Thursday, Friday, I don't know if they're going to practice on Saturday, he might even crack the top 20.
And that's where I have him. I already have him in the top 20. The only reason that, I don't have him any higher at this point is there's just a lot of other options out there that are looking strong right now. Dak Prescott's been putting up QB1 numbers in fantasy over the last stretch. Marcus Mariota finally looking healthy. Tough to move him ahead of those guys. Woods, you and I talked a bit earlier. I don't think you're as high on Lamar Jackson as Bill and I are.
No, I'm just not, and it's just I really don't know what to expect from him. And the little bits and pieces we've seen from him this season, I haven't been all that impressed on some of them. I mean, he had 5 rushes in Week 9. They put him in for sort of gadget plays. He took 5 rushes for 10 yards. He even had trouble delivering a handoff at one point in that game, if I remember correctly. So I think just some of the basic quarterbacking stuff he's still working on. Now, it's a big ask to step onto the field and just run one play while Flacco sort of splits out wide for a gadget thing and then get back to the bench. Maybe when he gets into the flow of a game, things go a little better. And I don't think they would trust Jackson to throw a ton of passes, so maybe you get a bunch of rushes too. But I just wouldn't be confident enough to, like Boone said, rank him over guys like Mariota and Prescott, who I think you could probably just pick up off the waiver wire. So top 25 sounds fine, but you're not starting a top 25 quarterback unless you play in a 2 QB league. So I'm just not all that interested in Jackson right now.
Well, if
Jackson, Bortles, Josh Rosen, Alex Smith, I'm starting Lamar Jackson over all those guys this week.
That's fair. I think that's fair. If Jackson does get the start this week, I mean, he's going to be helped a lot by the talent around him, especially on defense. The Ravens still have one of the better defenses in the league, and they play better at home. We used to say that about the Jaguars defense as well, but maybe we don't feel as strongly about them anymore after some of the recent performances. They've lost 5 straight games. During that time, they've given up an average of 28.6 points per game. That's including 3 passing touchdowns in each of their last 2 outings. Bill, do you still think that this is a unit to fear? I mean, especially for someone like Ben Roethlisberger, who had a 5 interception game against them last year during the regular season. I know he came back. He had a better performance in the playoffs. He had 5 touchdowns and 1 interception in the playoffs. But the question here comes down to, I guess, counting Ben Roethlisberger, is it safe to start your Steelers against this Jaguars defense now?
I don't think the Jaguars defense is a thing anymore. And that should be a valuable lesson to anyone that took them early, expecting them to be the number 1 fantasy defense for the second year in a row, something that hasn't happened in over 15 years. But people are still starting them, and they're like outside the top 15. I don't understand why people haven't caught on to see that the Jags are not the same defense that they were. They beat the Patriots. The Patriots then went on to lose to the Lions. And now all of a sudden we really kind of see that may have been the biggest win of their season. I don't buy into the fact that the Steelers, who I think have one of the best offenses in the league and are one of the best all-around teams in the league, are going to now struggle against a team that lost 5 in a row. Yeah, last year they beat them up in the regular season. They beat them up again in that AFC divisional round. But Big Ben still went off in that AFC divisional round, 469 yards, 5 touchdowns. Antonio Brown had 132, 2 touchdowns. Juju Smith only had 5 yards in that game, but he did catch a touchdown. And then it was a big day for Vance McDonald and Le'Veon Bell. So assume that James Conner takes the place of Le'Veon Bell's production. And I think the Steelers, you can't worry about the Jags anymore.
I'm with you there. I think maybe one thing you can consider going forward for the Jaguars is that there's still something of a Jalen Ramsey effect. I think he's still one of the best cornerbacks in the league. He pretty effectively shut down T.Y. Hilton last week, although there are maybe some concerns that Hilton's still playing with a bit of a bum hamstring. But, I mean, you're not going to bench Antonio Brown because of Jalen Ramsey. Certainly not doing that. So that may be a thing moving forward beyond Week 11. But other than that, I wouldn't fear the Jaguars' defense.
Yeah, I have Roethlisberger as a low-end QB1. I know A.J. Bouye's coming back. He's missed a little bit of time here, so that'll be a bit of a boost to that defense. But it might just be a team that's going off the rails here. They're going to start to see their playoff hopes just dwindle if they haven't already evaporated. And things maybe could get even worse in Jacksonville down the stretch here potentially. So every time this year, too, that I've looked at Roethlisberger in a tough matchup and thought, you know what, I should probably bump him down a little further. Every time, I think I've been wrong. Every time he's gone out, put up a multiple touchdown game when he's been on the road. You know, I think not so much the Jags defense this week. The thing that might scare me the most is that he's playing on the road at 1 o'clock, right? That seems to be the spot that he has the least success, but I'm still going to trot him out there. I think he's going to be fine as a low-end QB1. At this point in the year, we are seeing a lot of teams, I just said with the Jaguars, we're seeing a lot of teams start to get eliminated from playoff contention. And I'll say this, the Jags aren't eliminated yet. They definitely could go on a run, but they're getting awfully close. And I think when teams get to that point, they might start to turn their attention towards next season. It only makes sense, right? So, Bill, for you, are you ever hesitant using fantasy players on some of those teams? And I mean, right now, we can rattle off a few. I mean, when you look at the Raiders, the 49ers, the Giants, the Cardinals, the Jets, the Bills, I think we could safely say that there's not much going on for those teams as far as playoff hopes this year. Do you worry at all that fantasy production could dwindle a little bit with maybe the team starting to look towards next season?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for dynasty purposes, some of these losing teams can really help us. I think they go into evaluation mode and start scouting their players, their own players a little bit more, and figure who they want to keep around, who they can bank on next year, who they should look to replace in the offseason. I think a lot of ways that could help us. If you look at what Kyle Shanahan just said about Matt Breida, next year when Jerick McKinnon comes back, he wants to use both McKinnon and Breida on the field at the same time. At the end of the day, I try to stay away from bad teams. We have the 10 commandments for winning fantasy football on ffchamps.com. I think commandment number 7 is stay away from players on bad teams. And outside of the Giants and the 49ers, the teams that you just rattled off there, most people knew they were going to be bad this year. So maybe you had, Amari Cooper from the Raiders while he got traded. Maybe you drafted Marshawn Lynch while he's out. So I don't know how many bankable players on your fantasy team are really every week starters that you wouldn't already be on the fence about putting them in, whether they're making the playoffs or not.
Yeah, I mean, when we're looking at that list there too, I think you got to go case by case. And when you're looking, there's a couple teams that have very little hope, and organizationally, it's not looking great for them. We're talking about the Raiders, the Jets, the Bills. I think just the overall culture at those teams right now, the offenses don't look great. There really is some turmoil. Could even get worse as the season goes on. I do think with the 49ers, they seem to still be playing hard. I know in their last game, the broadcasters were talking about the fact that Kyle Shanahan's trying to change that culture, trying to keep everyone, with the same mindset that they are going to get better. They've had some terrible injuries at the start of the season, obviously, that hurt their chances. But with the Giants, I think a lot could change for the Giants. But right now, it seems like they're still pretty dedicated. We saw Odell Beckham talking about, they could go on a run here, and if they win out, maybe they still got a chance at the playoffs. So they still seem to be playing well, and obviously I have some big-time fantasy stars with Barkley and Odell Beckham. And the Cardinals even, too, I know you mentioned them as a team, a bad offense, but once they made the coordinator change, they have a young quarterback, they have a new offensive coordinator, they have some talented pieces there. It seems like there's at least a little bit of hope in that offense. I'm still willing to play guys there as well. I think they're going to play hard the rest of the way. David Johnson, Larry Fitzgerald's finally, he's getting more targets now with the new offensive coordinator. And Rosen could get better as the year goes on here as well. So I think it really is going to be case by case, but you have to keep that in mind, I think, looking at teams where if they don't have that much to play for, or if guys are even going to start to lose playing time. When you think about the Jets, maybe Isaiah Crowell just won't get as much playing time down the stretch here because maybe they are going to give McGuire more time, like things like that, right? You got to keep that in mind. And when we're talking about the playoffs, we mentioned before, the fantasy playoffs has to be in your mind at this point in the season. It's getting so close. We're almost there. The fantasy playoffs in most leagues, week 14, 15, and 16. Now is the time that you can start stashing players, getting ready for that stretch. So, Bill, you can name one player, you can name a couple players if you want, anyone that you're looking to stash at this point in the year who could be a potential difference maker come the fantasy playoffs.
I hate to disregard your question, but I tend not to stash players when I'm coming down to the fantasy playoffs. I'm more in trim the fat mode, make sure that I have enough depth where I can get by, but really dial down on my team and maybe handcuff some of my studs that I know have quality backups. I don't know if I'm really in stash mode for the playoffs, because then once the playoffs come, I'm very much a person that, dances with the player that, brought you. You party with the person that brought you to the dance.
For
and
sure.
that's what I do with fantasy. So in terms of stashing players, like, we talked about Rashad Penny a little bit earlier. He's on a couple of my teams. Do I think I can use him come the playoff times if all of a sudden Chris Carson is not healthy and Penny picks up this offense and Mike Davis doesn't look good, yeah, that's why he's on my team. But am I trying to work the waiver wire in a way where I look at someone's schedule that I wouldn't consider playing in week 8, but they have a really good week 14, 15, and 16 schedule? Probably not. I mean, Ben Watson has the number 1 tight end schedule for the playoffs. He's a quality starter. He'll get you 15 points. I have him on my team in a really deep league, but I'm not actively trying to stash guys that I don't think I could start right now.
And that's why this is good, right? We have other opinions. We have other people on the podcast who can throw out other approaches. That's fantastic. I think that's smart as well. If you have a really good team, you might just want to fortify for the playoffs. I think for me, I'm looking at it as if I have those open bench spots, the end of my bench, guys that I might want to throw there. We talked about one earlier, Lamar Jackson to me. That's a guy that I'm willing to throw there. Whether I have a good quarterback situation or not, I want to see what becomes of him. I know what his upside is, so I'm willing to, burn a bench spot just to see. And as I mentioned before, maybe you want to do it just to keep him away from an opponent in case he does hit his ceiling during that time. The team that I'm really looking at here, though, is the Broncos. And their schedule is great. And we know Philip Lindsay obviously is owned everywhere. Emmanuel Sanders, I think at this point, Cortland Sutton as well is owned in most places. I was surprised when I did the waiver wire column this week. He was only around 50% owned. I think a lot of people might have dropped him over the bye. But I think at this point, I think after the waivers process, he's probably owned in most places. But there are a couple guys on that team who I'm kind of intrigued by just because of the schedule. And the schedule for them, the 49ers, the Browns, and the Raiders. Doesn't get much better than that at that point in the year. And the guys on their team that are going to be available, still some spots, Royce Freeman. If something happens to Philip Lindsay with that schedule, I don't even think that Freeman's the best player out there talent-wise. But with that schedule, he could really star over that time. Those are games that they could really come on and do well in. And another guy, Jeff Hireman. I mean, we just saw him in the first game without Demaryius Thomas. He performed very, very well. Now, it could just be a one-off. It could just be, he got 10 catches in that game at basically the game of his life. That could just be a one-off, but it also could be a sign that maybe he's going to step up as a third receiving option since they don't have that much as their third receiver right now. Woods, anybody you got on your list?
I probably should have looked at what you guys had on your list because I had Ben Watson written down. I agree, very easy schedule there if you're looking for a tight end. Maybe I had Royce Freeman down too. So I'll just make the case for, and maybe this is more of a shallow league thing, see if you can get a piece of the Panthers passing offense. Devin Funch is probably owned. He's owned in most leagues. DJ Moore might be available. Greg Olsen, maybe there's a chance he's available. Likely owned in deeper leagues, but I just love that Panthers schedule. I tried to trade for Cam Newton in leagues before the trade deadline. I have big expectations for that team's passing offense over the playoff weeks in the fantasy playoffs.
And the trade
from your lips to God's ears, because Justin, you're number 1, first place in the Fantasy Pros Invitational League. I drafted Royce Freeman in the 4th round. I loved what I saw from him in August. I've been holding on to him all year because I need running backs in that league. So hopefully both of you guys are right about Royce Freeman coming on strong. I'd love that.
Nice. And if I'm correct, I think you're pretty close behind me there. I think you're in what? You're in 3rd behind me in that league?
I'm in 3rd, but I'm on a 2-game losing streak. You're on a 3-game winning streak. So one team's going in the right direction. My team, unfortunately, is going in the wrong direction.
All right. Well, let's try to help fantasy owners go in the right direction this week. And I alluded to it earlier. It's the part of the podcast I love doing at the end, looking at players who might be overlooked this week. And as I mentioned, we threw out Anthony Miller last week, had a huge game. So let's see if we can do that again. Bill, who you got for someone that's overlooked in week 11?
I got a running back and I got a wide receiver. Spencer Ware from the Kansas City Chiefs. We talked about it earlier. Highest point total, projected point over under since I think 2000. He had 9, 8, and 7 points the last 3 weeks in the standard format. 12, 12, and 8 in PPR. I could certainly see him getting into the end zone, getting a few catches, getting a few carries this week against the Rams. And then for a wide receiver, how about Sterling Shepard against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? 17, 10 points in 2 of the last 3 weeks in standard formats, 22, 7, and 12 in the PPR format. And he's playing against that Bucs defense. They stink.
I like those. I talked about Cortland Sutton at the top of the podcast, so I don't overlook him just because they're coming off a bye and he didn't do a ton right before that. The rest of mine are going to be pretty deep, guys. I think Doug Martin's kind of looks okay with the Raiders. I know that sounds kind of crazy to say, but he's fighting for his career, and I think we're seeing a little bit of something out of him. So maybe if you're desperate, you could look at him. I mentioned Maurice Harris earlier. I think he's a deep, usable PPR option with Jamison Crowder expected to sit out for the Redskins. And I wouldn't overlook Dante Moncrief, who I think is now pretty clearly the number one receiver for the Jaguars. Another deeper option if you're desperate for a play there.
Good stuff. I have one that might be kind of obvious here, but my first one is Alex Collins. And I think with all the attention that Lamar Jackson is going to get, some people might be forgetting Alex Collins, right? We know what the effect that a rushing quarterback can have on an offense. And one of the things it does is it really helps the running game. So we've seen Alex Collins, he faced 4 top 5 run defenses in his last 6 games. Saved his fantasy value in a bunch of those games just by scoring touchdowns, but now he gets that really easy schedule. He gets the Bengals, the Raiders, the Falcons, the Chiefs, and the Bucks over his next 5. And if Jackson gets under center, that's only going to help him. I think he's a solid RB2 the rest of the way, despite the fact that it seems like everybody's been pretty hard on him this year. Some of that, I think, was matchup based. My other guy, a little bit deeper here, is Christian Kirk. He's coming off a brutal game against the Chiefs last week, but before that, had 50 yards or a touchdown in 5 of his 6 games. It's a really favorable matchup this week for him. He's playing the Raiders. I really like his chances. I talked earlier there about how that offense could continue to get better. I think that's going to help him as well. I think he has a lot of talent, and I think we're going to see him potentially flirt with wide receiver 3 numbers this week and maybe the rest of the way. That's our show today. Make sure that you are following Bill on Twitter at Bill Enright and checking out all of his work over at ffchamps.com. Bill, really appreciate you joining us.
Had a blast, guys. Thanks for having me.
Woods and I are going to be back on Sunday night breaking down all the action from Week 11 and giving you the first look at the waiver wire and who you should be targeting next week. If you want to get in touch with Woods or just rejoice that the Le'Veon Bell saga is over for now, he's at David P. Woods on Twitter. To see all of our fantasy content, you should be logging onto theScore every single day, and you should also be following me on Twitter at Justin Boone. Big thanks to Bill. Big thanks to everybody out there for listening, and we will see you next time.
Said leave on time, my baby said leave on time.